What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Manny Pacquiao, 62 wins, 7 losses, and 2 draws, taking on Yordenis Ugas, 26 wins and 4 losses. And yes, this is very deflating that one of the best fights that could be made in the entire era, Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence Jr., was recently called off when Errol Spence reportedly had to pull out due to a detached retina in his eye. I've heard all types of theories and guesses in terms of what really happened in terms of, I'm not going to entertain any of that. All we know is Errol Spence is out, and the replacement is Yordenis Ugas, who most remember as having fought Shawn Porter, a super close fight that I thought he should have edged over Shawn Porter, although Shawn Porter was ultimately rewarded the split decision victory. Now, Manny Pacquiao was the WBA title. That WBA title has now changed hands to Yordenis Ugas, not through any win over Manny Pacquiao, but just because of Pacquiao's inactivity after beating Keith Thurman, giving Keith Thurman his first and only career loss. That fight took place in July 2019, and Manny Pacquiao didn't return to the ring for the next year and a half. So the WBA kind of had him in a champion in recess status while having Yordenis Ugas fight Errol Ramos in COVID September 2020 for a vacant WBA regular, the lesser title. Yordenis Ugas won that and then got elevated to super champion when they stripped Manny Pacquiao of his super champion status. Now, it goes without saying, Manny Pacquiao has had one of the most historic careers in boxing history. You could go all the way back when he was fighting at some of the lowest weight classes, and then later on he wins a title over Ledwaba, and then he goes up, has a classic win over Marco Antonio Barrera, a legend in his own right. Barrera was a legend. Manny Pacquiao was a surging fighter who was just on the upswing at that time. He stops Barrera. You know, he fights to a draw with Juan Manuel Marquez. He has 2 great fights with Eric Morales, losing the first, winning the second via stoppage, one of the best fights I've ever seen, and then stopping Morales again in the third. So he won 2 out of 3 over Morales. He ended up fighting a total of 4 times versus Marquez, the first being that draw where he dropped Marquez 3 times in the first round. Marquez neutralized Pacquiao, which he would continue to do over the course of the next few fights with Pacquiao. But Marquez won the majority of the rounds after getting dropped 3 times in that first round. They fought to a draw the first time. Manny Pacquiao edged out a decision win in the second fight. Manny Pacquiao was awarded a decision win in the third fight, even though I actually thought that Marquez beat Pacquiao in their third fight, and then Marquez dramatically knocked Manny Pacquiao out in their fourth fight. But yeah, well before that fourth fight, Manny Pacquiao was on the upswing. He starts jumping weight classes. He only fought 1 time at lightweight, stopped David Diaz. Then he jumps 2 divisions to fight Oscar De La Hoya in a fight where Oscar De La Hoya could barely lay a glove on Manny, and Manny couldn't miss when it came to hitting Oscar. I've never seen Oscar dominated like that. That ended up being Oscar's final professional fight. But yeah, Manny Pacquiao, after that turning point, because Golden Boy was essentially the Golden Goose, asked Floyd Mayweather, people's careers change after fighting De La Hoya, especially if they get the win. Ask Shane Mosley. Ask Floyd Mayweather, and obviously Manny Pacquiao. But Manny Pacquiao went on to fight them all. Dramatically knocked out Ricky Hatton in the second round of their fight. Fought Timothy Bradley 3 times, winning 2 out of the 3. Some believe he won all 3 of the fights. I get it. The first fight was ruled a decision win for Bradley. Very disputed win. But Manny Pacquiao has had such a long career, and there have been so many different stages in his career where you could actually find basically Hall of Fame careers within his illustrious career. Multiple Hall of Fame careers in one career. Now, Manny Pacquiao's last loss, it wasn't the Floyd Mayweather loss in 2015, and they actually fought a few years too late. Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao should have been fighting around the time that Manny Pacquiao stopped Miguel Cotto in 2009, but it didn't happen for a few years. There are differing reasons and disputed reasons as to why. According to Floyd and his team, it had to do with Manny Pacquiao not agreeing to certain drug testing, PED testing leading up to the fight. Some thought that Floyd was, and his team were asking for too big a percentage split on the Floyd side. I'm not going to get into why it didn't happen, but the fight didn't happen for several years, and it ended up happening in 2015. But that was not Manny Pacquiao Pacquiao's final loss. His last loss, or most recent loss, was 2 years after that when he fought Jeff Horn and lost another disputed decision in Jeff Horn's continent of Australia. That was a unanimous decision win, but they're very differing opinions. Teddy Atlas went crazy after that decision, but a lot of people thought Manny Pacquiao should have won that fight. It was a close fight, very rugged fight. Jeff Horn kind of roughed him up, and Jeff Horn, quite frankly, hasn't been the same since that Manny Pacquiao fight. Stopped multiple times by, Michael Zarafa, Tim Tszyu, the son of Costa Tszyu. But yeah, after that last loss for Manny Pacquiao, he's fought Lucas Matthysse, Adrian Broner. He stopped Lucas Matthysse via TKO in the 7th round and then won a unanimous decision against Adrian Broner. Pretty much dominated that fight. It was about as lopsided as Mikey Garcia versus Adrian Broner. Broner just has this issue where he just doesn't let his hands go and throw enough punches to reliably win rounds. And he was kind of overwhelmed by Manny Pacquiao's hand speed, strength, and volume. And that win over Lucas Matthysse was a pretty diminished Lucas Matthysse. I believe he retired after that fight, but Manny Pacquiao had the speed advantage, had the strength advantage, even might have had the size advantage. Lucas Matthysse was never a natural 147. He had his best days at 140 and was stopped, later on in his career by Victor Postal. And that was, before his fight versus Pacquiao. But yeah, once upon a time, Lucas Matthysse was a very dangerous fighter. He stopped Lamont Peterson, fought a great fight versus prime Danny Garcia at 140. Well, after those Lucas Matthysse and Adrian Broner wins for Manny Pacquiao, he fought Keith Thurman, then undefeated, then still a WBA champion. Keith Thurman is a 2-time champion, and he had beaten the likes of Sean Porter and Danny Garcia, but had been injured and inactive for almost 2 years after those back-to-back wins. Basically, at the height of Keith Thurman's success and popularity, he basically has a long layoff, and then he comes back and fights Josecito Lopez, starts getting hurt in the middle rounds in a way that we had never seen Keith Thurman hurt. We had seen him hurt badly to the body before against Luis Collazo, but Josecito Lopez looked like he was about to knock Keith Thurman out, to the point where Keith Thurman looked damn near defenseless as he was backing up, getting his head rocked back by Josecito Lopez, who isn't an elite fighter. He's a near elite-ish fighter, but I have trouble believing that Keith Thurman would have had that type of difficulty with Josecito Lopez if it was still truly prime Keith Thurman. But you could say that he was shaking the rust off. And then after that decision win over Lopez, because Keith Thurman still won the fight, Keith Thurman fights Manny Pacquiao, and the audience is totally split as to what the hell is going to happen here. Because Keith Thurman was, for, again, a couple years, looked at as the elite at 147, basically probably the best in the post-Floyd Mayweather era. For a while, it was like Keith Thurman and then Kell Brook when Kell Brook beat Sean Porter, and then obviously Errol Spence came up and beat Kell Brooks. But you always had Manny Pacquiao kind of sticking around, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but he at the time was fighting like Lucas Matthysse and Adrian Broner. He wasn't fighting the guys who are truly seen to be the top of the division. That's why it was so surprising, one, when he announced that he was going to fight Keith Thurman, and then more recently, when they announced that he was going to fight Errol Spence. I was like, what? I never would have thought that a 40 to 42-year-old Manny Pacquiao was going to try to dare to be great once again against the most dangerous guys at welterweight. I mean, Pacquiao was beating Margarito and Clottey and Miguel Cotto back in 2009, 2010. What the hell is he doing in 2020, 2019, 2021? Fighting Keith Thurman and Errol Spence Jr. Well, Manny Pacquiao dropped Keith Thurman in the first round. Stunning. He hurt him again to the body in the middle rounds, to the point where Keith Thurman spit the mouthpiece out and was like circling the ring, trying to buy himself some time. And then Keith Thurman really battled back, won some of the later rounds, and ended up losing. Keith Thurman lost to Manny Pacquiao via split decision. An outstanding accomplishment for Manny Pacquiao to give Keith Thurman, again, his first and only loss, even though it might have been a reduced version of Keith Thurman. And because of the question marks surrounding Keith Thurman and where he is in his career, a lot of people were still kind of skeptical, like, okay, that was great, Manny, but what was Keith Thurman exactly at that time? Well, Manny Pacquiao then announced about a year and a half later that he was going to be fighting Errol Spence Jr., who was coming off of a win over Danny Garcia, a pretty commanding victory over Danny Garcia. Errol Spence, the undefeated WBC and IBF champion? Are you kidding me? Well, that's what Manny Pacquiao announced, and like 10 days before the fight's supposed to take place. Super disappointingly, Errol Spence has to withdraw from the fight. Again, totally deflating. I hope Errol Spence gets well. He's a tremendous fighter, tremendous competitor, and I, like everybody else, would have loved to see Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence Jr. Unbelievable. It almost felt too good to be true, and damn it. Well, now the replacement is Yordenis Ugas. Again, 26 wins, 4 losses, and he is a Cuban fighter, and Cuban has a deep history in boxing. You know, Teofilo Stevenson is probably the greatest heavyweight fighter to never fight professionally. In fact, once upon a time in the 70s, they were trying to get an exhibition together between Teofilo Stevenson, 3-time Olympic gold medalist, versus the great Muhammad Ali. The fight never materialized, but that tells you where people thought of Teofilo Stevenson in terms of where he was on the pecking order. Like, this was the real deal. Well, La Finca, the Cuban boxing school, has produced several great fighters over the years. Joel Casamayor, Kid Gallivan, Arislandi Lara, Luis Ortiz, Yordenis Gamboa. And, you know, the list continues. But we have Yordenis Ugas, Cuban fighter, very technical fighter. You know, he had a couple losses earlier in his career, and the latest of which in the first half of his career was to Amir Imam. I don't know if you remember, Amir Imam lost a big fight against Jose Ramirez a couple years ago. Imam, once a big-time prospect, you know, beat Yordenis Ugas via 8-round decision, and then Ugas takes the next 2 years out of the ring. That fight against Imam was in 2014. He doesn't return until 2016, and then he goes on and wins like his next 8 fights. And along the way, he beats Thomas Delorme, who I think was the last guy Terrence Crawford had to beat at 140 to unify all 4 of the belts. Well, Ugas beat Delorme via unanimous decision in 2017, and then he beats Ray Robinson, the slick southpaw, who should have been awarded, I believe, a decision win over both Josh Kelly and against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. But Robinson wasn't awarded the win in either. Well, Yordenis Ugas beat Ray Robinson via 7th round TKO. He then stops Jonathan Batista in the 2nd round, and then he fights Cesar Barrionuevo. And this was on the Sean Porter versus Danny Garcia undercard, and he beats Barrionuevo via unanimous decision. So he is surging now. And by the way, when he had fought Imam back in 2014 and he had those couple of losses early in his career, that was at 140. So he was then undefeated for his next 8 fights at 147. And that win over Barrionuevo was for basically an interim status. It wasn't for an actual belt, but it was essentially for a #1 contender spot to challenge Sean Porter for Sean Porter's WBC Welterweight title. So then he fights Sean Porter, and I haven't seen Sean Porter lose rounds that dramatically, knockdown against Errol Spence notwithstanding, since Kell Brook beat Sean Porter a few years back. But Yordenis Ugas, through like 7 and 8 rounds, he looked like he was winning the fight versus Porter pretty commandingly. I mean, there were a couple swing rounds in there, but he was just working Porter's body like crazy, and he was counterpunching with a straight right hand very effectively. You know how Sean Porter likes to jump in the pocket. Well, against Ugas, Porter was forced, well, not forced, he might have chosen to stand on the outside and box a little bit more, because when he was coming in to collapse the pocket, he was getting hit a lot. And Ugas, because he keeps a tight guard, he keeps his shoulders up, and he's a lot taller than Porter, it just looked like he had the command over this seemingly smaller Sean Porter. So visually, it looked like, you know, Joe Goosen thought that Ugas was beating Porter. Joe Goosen, the trainer who also does commentary for PBC, along with Lennox Lewis. You know, Lennox Lewis, I think, thought that Porter might have been winning the fight. It was close. But headed into the scorecards, people thought that maybe it was going to be a draw, or maybe Ugas was going to upset the champion, Sean Porter. Well, there were a bunch of boos when it was announced that Sean Porter won that fight via split decision. You know, it was one of those post-fight interviews where you could kind of tell Sean Porter didn't really think that he won the fight, but you can't say that in the post-fight. Difficult position to be in. It's not the fighter's fault that it was bad judging, or at least questionable judging, but Sean Porter was awarded the decision win there. And then Ugas beats Omar Figueroa Jr., who's totally fallen off a cliff abilities-wise. He was an undefeated, really good fighter back in the day. Stopped Robert the Ghost Guerrero and others. Well, Omar Figueroa looks like he's kind of a shot fighter at this point. He's gotten stopped more recently than this decision loss against against Ugas. Ugas fought Omar Figueroa and pretty much dominated the fight. This was, I believe, on the Pacquiao versus Keith Thurman undercard. Let me double check that. Yeah, it was on the Pacquiao-Thurman undercard. Ugas pretty much dominated and just beat the hell out of Figueroa. Unanimous decision win. And then he fights Mike Dallas Jr., stops him in the 7th round. And that was February 2020. So then COVID hits. And then about 7-8 months later, Ugas is back in the ring. Remember when they started first bringing the fights back after COVID kicked off? So this would have been September 2020. And he fights Abel Ramos. And you know, as I'm watching the fight, I'm thinking, okay, Ugas looks good and he's winning just about all of the rounds. And all of the commentators thought the same thing. Well, guess what? When they went into the scorecards, they said via split decision. So first of all, you're thinking, whoa, what the hell? You were expecting like 10 rounds to 2, 11 rounds to 1. Ugas winning just about everything against Abel Ramos. Well, one of the judges had it 117 to 111. Abel Ramos. And this was, by the way, for a regular WBA title. Basically one of those hold you over titles while the champion continues to do his thing. So they were really trying to give Ugas, or the winner of Ugas versus Ramos, the lesser belt. And you cannot explain with any credibility how anybody could have Abel Ramos winning this fight against Ugas. You know, there was just that fight featuring Mikhail Fox where he got robbed on the scorecards to the point where the judge, and this was another WBA fight for another BS belt, and one of the judges had it, I think, 117, 111 for the guy who clearly didn't win the fight. And that judge is actually suspended indefinitely. And, I mean, that's not the only case of super questionable judging. I mean, one of the judges had Jermell Charlo winning by a few rounds over Brian Castano. So, I mean, we've been seeing a lot of sketchy stuff. And the fact that Ugas, I mean, the right guy won the fight in Ugas versus Ramos, but when you have that weird of a scorecard, like, it's indescribable. And even the scorecards that Ugas won, they were 115 to 113. So just across the board, that one was a head scratcher. Like, even the commentators were like, you've got to be kidding me. It was that bad. Well, again, that was September 2020, and that was the last time Ugas has been in the ring. So he's been out of the ring for almost an entire year, and now he is stepping in on short notice. He was already preparing for another fight on what was supposed to be the Pacquiao versus Spence undercard, but he was called up to take on Manny Pacquiao in the wake of Errol Spence pulling out. So what do I think about Manny Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas? Well, we know what Manny Pacquiao can do. We know what he brings to the table, assuming that this is even close to the same Manny Pacquiao that was fighting Keith Thurman. And again, we still have the question marks of where exactly is Keith Thurman. You know, he hasn't been in the ring since that fight in July 2019. So Manny Pacquiao obviously still has fast hands, fast enough to drop Keith Thurman in the first round. He always catches people and surprises the hell out of them early in the fight because there's no way you could game plan for Manny Pacquiao's hand speed. Ugas is going to be no different. He's going to be surprised when he sees 6-punch combinations coming at him at high speeds, weird angles, low center of gravity with Manny Pacquiao's head movement and his ability to close the distance with his amazing legs. Again, this is assuming this is the same Manny Pacquiao. I don't know that. I was picking Errol Spence to beat Manny Pacquiao. I didn't release the video. I was going to drop it in a couple days, but I was going to pick Errol Spence to win by a couple rounds. Largely because a lot of people don't think Manny Pacquiao can be controlled with a jab, but Errol Spence's jab, to me, is one of the best punches in boxing, which is amazing because Errol Spence was a seeker and destroyer before he showed us what he had with the jab versus Mikey Garcia, and then recently against Danny Garcia. Obviously, he wasn't able to control Sean Porter as well with the jab, but Yordenis Ugas doesn't have the same jab as Errol Spence. He does have a good double jab, but he's not a southpaw like Errol Spence, so this is going to be a different look for Manny Pacquiao, even though Pacquiao, although he was probably training, obviously, for a lefty in Errol Spence, hasn't fought a true lefty since David Diaz, and that was way back in 2008. So Manny Pacquiao hasn't fought a southpaw in 13 years, so that would have been interesting. So now, instead of that, he's getting Ugas, a conventional fighter, but who commits to the body in a way that you don't see a lot of fighters commit to as thoroughly. Like, Ugas does tons of work to the body, and he's a really good counter puncher too. Like I said, when Sean Porter was jumping in, he has something meeting Sean Porter on a lot of those exchanges. He throws kind of a whipping wide right to the body, and he'll throw a whipping left to the body. He'll mix his jab up. He'll go high and low with the jab. Again, he keeps a high guard. He's pretty good defensively. But, you know, Ugas isn't a spring chicken either. I don't think that he's got the same energy levels through a long fight that he did even a couple years ago against Sean Porter. I do think that he kind of slowed down a little bit against Abel Ramos. And Sean Porter, I thought, won a few of those later rounds. So I don't think that Ugas was as sharp and authoritative in the last 5 rounds or last 3-4 rounds that he was in those rounds like 3 to 7, 8. So I think that Manny Pacquiao is obviously going to have the visible hand speed where it's going to look overwhelming. And I think that in a lot of the close rounds, Manny Pacquiao is going to have the wind at his back, crowd noise wise. So it's going to seem very energetic when Manny Pacquiao is letting his hands go against a much bigger. This is like 5'5" versus 5'9". Ugas, again, is going to have that tight guard, but I think that he's going to be a little slow on the trigger. Ugas is 35 again. Manny Pacquiao is 42. But again, Manny Pacquiao has this inexplicable hand speed at 42. So I think that this fight might look like an older man's version of Manny Pacquiao versus Joshua Clottey. Do you remember when Manny Pacquiao was on that crazy run where he knocked out David Diaz, stopped De La Hoya, knocked out Ricky Hatton, stopped Miguel Cotto, then fought Clottey, and Clottey basically just turtled up for what seemed like the entire fight, just shaking his head no the whole time. I kind of think that Ugas is not going to be able to let his hands go. Okay, this is the question. Can Ugas slow Manny Pacquiao down with his body work? If the answer is yes, he's got a chance. If the answer is no, I think he's going to lose the vast majority of the rounds here. And I do think that he will be effective in going to the body. But I think that Manny Pacquiao is going to bank enough of the early rounds to where even if he slows down during the middle rounds, that I expect Ugas to then slow down in the late rounds to where Manny Pacquiao might bank most of the early rounds. Ugas might take some of the middle rounds with his work like Keith Thurman did against Manny. But I think that Manny could pull through in like the last 3 to 4 rounds and win the majority of those as Ugas then slows down and becomes a little less sharp and that guard starts to drop a little bit more. Manny Pacquiao just seems to have that nonstop. Well, it used to be nonstop. Now he picks his spots a little bit more, but his volume is always high. And Ugas, to be fair, in his recent fights, has actually picked up the volume. Like, he is throwing more jabs as of late. And again, he is really throwing combinations to the body. The question is, can he basically catch Manny Pacquiao when Manny Pacquiao jumps in? Can he catch him with that right hand? Can he then follow Manny Pacquiao once Manny Pacquiao's done throwing his combinations? Can he then take the steps forward to chase Manny Pacquiao? You know how Pacquiao also picks his spots, goes into the ropes, and does a little turtling up himself before tapping his gloves together, holding his hands up, and then coming back with his punches. He's done that like his whole career, it seems, right? So if Ugas can effectively make Pacquiao pay for those moments by going to the body, he can have a chance at winning. But again, I mean, we've seen Miguel Cotto try to do it. We've seen Jesse Vargas try to do it. It's just much easier said than done. I think this is going to be a pretty close fight, but I do think that Ugas, in a way, is going to be a little bit overwhelmed by the whirlwind of Manny Pacquiao punches to where Manny Pacquiao is going to win more rounds than Ugas. I don't think any guy stops the other. I can't see Manny Pacquiao stopping the very strong, physically strong, and just durable Ugas. Very crafty as well, very experienced. And I don't see Ugas stopping Manny Pacquiao. Ugas hasn't, he stopped Mike Dallas in February of last year and then stopped Batista and Ray Robinson in 2018. But Ugas wins most of his fights, even the ones that he dominates. He wins most of them by decision. And Manny Pacquiao, we've never seen him succumb to damage and get stopped. At least since he's been famous. I know he had those couple knockout losses super early in his career. We're talking now like damn near like 22 and 25 years ago. Manny Pacquiao has like had, a 26-year career in total? Something crazy. But yeah, Manny Pacquiao, aside from those super early ones, yes, he got knocked out. But that was like a one punch. I just ran into the wrong thing from Marquez. But we've never seen him get beaten up and basically TKO'd where he's against the ropes, unable to defend himself. The ref needs to jump in. We haven't seen that from Pacquiao. I don't expect to see that against Yordenis Ugas. So I have Pacquiao via decision. I don't know if it's going to be close enough to be a split decision. Maybe, especially with the unpredictability in judging. But I think to most viewers, it's going to look like Pacquiao wins a 116 to 112-ish type of decision. So I do think Ugas is going to win a few rounds here, just not as many as Manny Pacquiao. So the question is, does Manny Pacquiao then use that momentum if he does beat Ugas via decision? Does he then parlay that into an eventual, I mean, one can only hope and wish that Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence Jr. eventually takes place. And Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford needs to take place before Terrence Crawford turns 35 years old. If he's like 35, 36 by the time that fight happens, that would be a huge boxing travesty in my opinion. But yeah, let me know what you think about Manny Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas. First of all, what's your enthusiasm level in this fight, and who are you going with and how? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.